An abandoned wolf pup hid under a broken bridge, desperate for safety and warmth. As night fell in the wild forest, he trembled alone, haunted by the absence of his family. But little did he know, fate had something extraordinary in store. A fierce grizzly bear would soon approach, changing the pup's life forever. Get ready for a gripping tale of survival, unexpected friendships, and the bonds that defy nature's harshest rules. Deep within an ancient forest, where towering pines stretched toward an endless sky, a wolf pup named Shadow was born into a strong and thriving pack. His mother, a graceful she-wolf with silver fur, cradled him close during those first vulnerable weeks. He grew up surrounded by warmth, protection, and the rhythmic howls that echoed through the trees each night. A symphony of belonging that made him feel safe and cherished. His father, the pack's alpha, watched over him with fierce pride. Shadow had siblings who played with him, elders who taught him the ways of survival, and a sense of purpose that only a true member of the pack could experience. Life was perfect in every way, until one fateful evening when everything shattered in an instant. A violent storm rolled in without warning, splitting the sky with jagged lightning and deafening thunder that shook the very earth beneath their paws. The clouds darkened to an almost black hue, and the wind howled like 1,000 angry spirits. The pack scattered in panic, each member fighting desperately to survive the chaos and find shelter. Shadow, only months old and woefully inexperienced in the ways of nature's fury, became separated from his mother in the blinding darkness. He ran blindly through the downpour, his small paws slipping and sliding on wet earth, his desperate cries for his family swallowed by the roaring wind and crashing thunder. He called out again and again, his voice growing hoarse and weak. Hours passed like an eternity. Days followed, each one more agonizing than the last. The pup searched desperately through every corner of the forest for any sign of his pack, a familiar scent, a distant howl, anything. But they were gone, vanished as if they had never existed. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He was truly alone, exhausted beyond measure, starving with hunger gnawing at his belly, and broken-hearted by the loss of everything he had ever known. Shadow stumbled upon a broken bridge jutting over a shallow ravine. The structure was ancient and weathered, its wooden planks rotting and crumbling with age. Beneath it, he found shelter, a sanctuary from the relentless wilderness and the dangers that lurked in every shadow. He huddled in the darkness beneath the bridge, his tiny body trembling not just from the bitter cold, but from the crushing weight of abandonment and despair. For the first time in his young life, he was completely and utterly alone, with no one to comfort him or guide him through the darkness. But as night fell and an impenetrable darkness consumed the forest, Shadow had no idea that something massive was moving through the trees, something with powerful muscles, sharp claws, and a presence that commanded respect, something that would either end his suffering or change it forever in ways he could never imagine. The forest fell into an eerie silence as the storm finally passed, leaving behind only the gentle patter of rain dripping from the canopy above. Shadow lay curled beneath the broken bridge, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes growing heavier with each passing moment. His small body ached from hunger and exhaustion, every bone feeling as though it might shatter if he moved too quickly. His spirit felt as broken and shattered as the rotting wood surrounding him, and despair hung over him like a thick fog that refused to lift. He drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, plagued by nightmares of the violent storm and the devastating loss of his family. In his dreams, he heard his mother's voice calling to him, her tone filled with concern and love. But no matter how hard he tried to run toward her, His legs would not obey. He could never reach her, no matter how desperately he wanted to. Hours passed like days as Shadow lay in his makeshift shelter, listening to the sounds of the forest settling after the chaos. Owls hooted in the distance, and small creatures scurried through the underbrush, going about their nightly routines as if the world had not just been torn apart by nature's fury. The rain continued to fall, though now it was gentle and steady rather than violent and chaotic. Shadow's stomach growled painfully, a constant reminder of his hunger and vulnerability. He was so weak that he could barely lift his head, let alone venture out into the dangerous forest to search for food. As the moon rose high above the treetops, casting silver light through the gaps in the canopy and illuminating the forest floor in ethereal patterns, a low rumbling sound echoed through the ancient trees. It was a sound so deep and powerful that it vibrated through the earth itself, traveling through the ground and into Shadow's small body. The pup's eyes snapped open instantly, his survival instinct screaming danger with an intensity that jolted him awake from his restless sleep. His heart began to race, pounding so hard against his ribs that he thought it might burst from his chest. Every nerve in his body was on high alert, every muscle tensed and ready to flee, though he knew there was nowhere to run. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows beneath the bridge, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible, hoping that whatever was approaching would simply pass him by. The sound grew louder with each passing second, closer and more intense, reverberating through the forest like the footsteps of some ancient giant. Branches cracked and splintered as something enormous moved through the forest with an almost deliberate and purposeful pace, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The ground trembled with each heavy footfall. Trees swayed as the massive creature brushed past them, barely seeming to notice their presence. Shadow's breathing became rapid and shallow, and he had to force himself to stay silent, to not make even the slightest sound that might give away his location. Then, through the darkness and the fading moonlight, a massive silhouette appeared at the edge of the bridge. It was a grizzly bear, one of the largest and most formidable predators in the entire forest. His fur was thick and matted, dark brown in color, bearing the scars and marks of countless battles and harsh winters. His muscles rippled beneath his skin with every movement, a testament to his raw power and strength. His paws were the size of dinner plates, each one equipped with claws that could tear through stone, through flesh, through bone with equal ease. This was no ordinary bear. This was a creature that commanded absolute respect and fear from every living thing in the forest. Shadow's blood ran cold as ice water flooded his veins. He had heard stories from the older wolves about bears, ancient tales passed down through generations of their incredible strength, their ferocity, their complete and utter dominance over the animal kingdom. Bears were the undisputed kings of the forest, feared even by the largest wolf packs. The bear stopped directly above the bridge, his massive head lowering as he sniffed the air with powerful, deliberate breaths. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of the small wolf pup hiding beneath the rotting wooden structure. Shadow held his breath, every muscle in his body frozen in absolute terror. He knew with certainty that if the bear discovered him, he would be crushed in an instant, his small body no match for the creature's overwhelming power. There would be no escape, no mercy, no hope, no second chances. This was the end. He was certain of it. He closed his eyes and waited for death to come. But then something completely unexpected happened. The bear let out a low, almost mournful sound, a cry that seemed to carry with it a profound sadness and loneliness that echoed through the forest like a funeral dirge. It was not the aggressive roar of a predator hunting prey, not the territorial growl of a beast defending its domain. but something far more complex and deeply emotional. It was a sound of pain, of loss, of a creature burdened by its own weight of suffering. Shadow watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. The bear seemed troubled, lonely even. The massive creature circled the bridge slowly, his enormous body moving with surprising grace and gentleness for such a large and powerful animal. His movements were deliberate and almost gentle, as if he were searching for something or someone. Shadow watched from beneath the bridge, his fear gradually transforming into something else. Confusion mixed with a strange sense of recognition. The bear seemed to be grieving, mourning something or someone he had lost. The pup could see it in the way the bear moved, in the heaviness of his presence, in the mournful sounds he continued to make. The bear lay down beside the bridge, his enormous body settling onto the forest floor with a heavy thud that shook the ground beneath Shadow. He was close enough that Shadow could hear his breathing, could see the rise and fall of his massive chest as air moved in and out of his lungs. The bear's breathing was labored and heavy, filled with an exhaustion that seemed to go far deeper than mere physical tiredness. For what felt like an eternity, neither creature moved. The wolf pup and the grizzly bear, natural enemies, predator and prey, locked in an eternal struggle for survival in the natural world, existed in a strange, suspended moment of understanding that transcended the laws of nature. And in that profound moment, something shifted deep within both of them. Something changed. Something awakened. Two broken creatures, each carrying their own unbearable weight of loneliness and loss, had found each other in the darkness. And in that darkness, they discovered something neither expected, the possibility of connection, of companionship, of hope. The first light of dawn broke through the forest canopy, casting golden rays of ethereal beauty across the damp earth and glistening leaves. Shadow's eyes fluttered open slowly, as if he were awakening from a deep and dreamless sleep. Though in reality, his slumber had been restless and filled with troubled visions. He had survived the night, a fact that seemed almost miraculous and defied all logic given the extraordinary and terrifying circumstances. But more than that, he had survived in the immediate presence of a grizzly bear, a creature that by all natural law and the ancient rules of the forest should have ended his life without hesitation or remorse. Yet here he was, still breathing, still alive, still huddled beneath the bridge in the same protective spot where he had cowered in abject terror just hours before, waiting for death that never came. The bear was still there, lying on his side just beyond the bridge's weathered edge, his massive body partially illuminated by the soft morning light. His enormous form rose and fell with each deep, rhythmic breath, his dark eyes closed in what appeared to be a restless and troubled sleep. Even in slumber, the creature's raw power and dominance were evident to anyone who looked upon him. His muscles twitched occasionally with involuntary spasms, and his massive paws clenched and unclenched repeatedly as if he were reliving some distant memory or troubling dream that haunted even his unconscious mind. Shadow studied the bear with intense fascination and careful attention, noting every detail and every scar that crisscrossed his powerful body, like a map of his difficult life. There was a particularly deep gash along his left shoulder, the wound long, since healed but still visible as a thick line of scar tissue that spoke of a vicious encounter. His right ear was torn and ragged, missing a significant portion of its upper edge. His nose bore the marks of countless battles, and his fur was matted and worn in places, revealing the toll that years of survival had taken on this magnificent creature. This was a bear who had endured tremendous hardship and suffering throughout his long life, who had fought countless battles against other bears, against hunters, against the unforgiving forces of nature itself, and had somehow managed to survive against impossible odds. Shadow could see in every scar and every worn patch of fur a story of struggle, of pain, of perseverance. And yet, despite all of this, the bear had chosen not to harm him. This realization filled Shadow with a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude, wonder, and a strange sense of kinship with this powerful creature. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold, the bear began to stir from his restless slumber. His eyes opened slowly and deliberately, revealing dark brown irises that held a surprising depth of emotion and intelligence that seemed almost human in their complexity. The bear stretched his massive limbs with careful deliberation, extending each enormous paw and flexing his powerful muscles with the precision of a creature who understood the importance of maintaining his strength and flexibility. A low groan escaped his throat, not a sound of aggression or threat, but rather one of stiffness and age, the sound of a body that had endured many years of hard living. Shadow realized with a sudden start that this was not a young bear in his prime, full of youthful vigor and strength, but rather an older creature, perhaps well past the peak of his physical prowess and vitality. The realization brought with it a new understanding. This bear, like Shadow himself, was a survivor, someone who had learned to endure despite overwhelming odds. The bear rose to his feet with surprising grace and gentleness, his movements careful and measured, as if he were conserving his energy and taking care not to aggravate old injuries. He walked a short distance away from the bridge with deliberate steps, his massive paws making barely a sound despite his enormous weight. He approached a small stream that ran through the forest, its water clear and cold, fed by underground springs and the recent rainfall. The bear began to drink from the stream with deep, satisfied gulps, the water splashing around his massive muzzle. Shadow watched, completely mesmerized by the sight of this enormous and powerful creature, performing such a simple, peaceful, and almost meditative action. There was something almost spiritual about it, as if the bear were drawing strength and renewal from the ancient forest itself. The bear drank deeply and thoroughly, seeming to draw not just physical nourishment, but also spiritual sustenance from the pure forest water. Then he shook his massive head with a powerful motion, sending droplets of water flying in all directions, creating a sparkling mist that caught the morning sunlight. He stood there for a long moment afterward, his gaze distant and contemplative, as if he were thinking about something far away, or perhaps mourning someone he had lost long ago. His expression was one of profound sadness and longing, and Shadow found himself wondering about the bear's past, about what losses and traumas had shaped this magnificent creature into who he was. Shadow's stomach growled painfully, a sound that seemed impossibly loud and intrusive in the quiet and peaceful forest. He cringed instinctively, his entire body tensing as he expected the bear to react with sudden aggression or to attack. But the bear simply turned his head with measured slowness, his dark eyes meeting Shadow's for the first time in the clear light of day. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither creature moved or made a sound. The tension hung thick in the air between them. Shadow could see the intelligence in those ancient eyes, the profound sadness, the deep loneliness that mirrored his own pain and suffering so perfectly that it was as if they were looking into a mirror of each other's souls. The bear studied the small wolf pup with what appeared to be curiosity and understanding rather than hunger or predatory interest. Then, to Shadow's absolute astonishment and disbelief, the bear did something completely unexpected and extraordinary. He rose to his feet with careful deliberation and turned away, walking deeper into the forest with purpose and determination. His massive form moved through the trees with surprising silence, and Shadow watched as the enormous creature disappeared among the thick vegetation and ancient trees, wondering if this was the end of their strange and miraculous encounter. Would the bear return? Should Shadow seize this opportunity and flee while he had the chance? But something held him in place, a feeling he could not quite name or understand, an instinct that told him to wait, to trust, to believe that the bear would return. The bear returned within the hour, carrying something substantial in his massive jaws. It was a large salmon, freshly caught from the stream, its silver scales still gleaming with moisture. The bear moved carefully, ensuring that the precious catch did not slip from his grip. He laid the fish down gently on the forest floor with surprising tenderness, just at the edge of the bridge where Shadow could easily reach it. The pup stared at the offering in complete disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. Was the bear actually giving him food, sharing his hard-won catch with a small wolf pup? Such a thing seemed impossible, defying everything Shadow understood about the natural world and the rigid hierarchy of predators and prey that governed forest life. Shadow crept forward cautiously, his hunger warring with his lingering fear and uncertainty. His tiny body trembled as he approached the fish, his muscles coiled and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. He half expected the bear to lash out suddenly in attack, to reveal that this had all been some sort of cruel game or test. But the bear simply watched with patient eyes. His massive form settled comfortably on the ground, several feet away, giving the pup space and time to eat without interference or threat. The bear's posture was non-threatening, almost protective, as if he were standing guard over Shadow while the pup consumed the nourishment he so desperately needed. Shadow fell upon the fish with desperate hunger, devouring it with an intensity and ferocity born of days without proper food. He tore into the flesh with his small teeth, consuming every morsel he could manage, driven by an instinctive need to survive. The nourishment spread through his small body like warmth and life itself, restoring some of his strength and vitality with each bite. His ribs, which had been painfully visible just moments before, seemed to fill out slightly as the protein and nutrients were absorbed. Color returned to his eyes, and his movements became less sluggish and more energetic. When Shadow finished eating, he looked up at the bear with new understanding dawning in his bright eyes. This creature was not his enemy, not a threat to be feared and avoided. This massive, powerful being, who could crush him with a single paw, had chosen instead to help him, to feed him, to keep him alive despite having no obligation to do so. Shadow approached the bear slowly and cautiously, his tail held low in a gesture of respect and submission, his entire body language communicating trust and gratitude. The bear watched the pup's approach without moving, his dark eyes steady and patient, filled with what appeared to be compassion and understanding. Shadow reached the bear's massive paw and gently touched it with his small nose, feeling the warmth of the fur and the solid muscle beneath. It was warm and alive, and beneath the thick fur and hard muscle, he could feel the steady beating of the bear's powerful heart, a rhythm that seemed to echo with life and purpose. In that moment of connection, something profound and transformative shifted between them, something that transcended the natural order and the ancient rules of the forest. A bond began to form between them, fragile and tentative at first, yet undeniable and powerful in its authenticity. The wolf pup and the grizzly bear, two creatures who should have been mortal enemies locked in an eternal struggle for survival, had become something far more important and meaningful. They had become companions. They had become family in the truest sense of the word. The bear lowered his massive head with infinite gentleness and carefully touched his nose to Shadow's small body. It was a gesture laden with profound meaning, a gesture of acceptance and protection, of a promise made in silence that he would not abandon this small creature, as the pup's own family had been torn away by the violence of the storm. And Shadow, in turn, understood with absolute certainty that he had found something precious and irreplaceable, not just a protector or a provider of food, but a kindred spirit who understood loss and loneliness as deeply and completely as he did. As the day wore on, the bear remained by the bridge, and Shadow stayed close to his new companion, never venturing far from his protective presence. The forest around them seemed to acknowledge this unlikely alliance, as if nature itself recognized and honored that something extraordinary and unprecedented had occurred. The birds sang differently, the wind blew more gently, and even the rustling of leaves seemed to carry a note of approval. Two broken souls, each carrying unbearable weights of grief and isolation, had found each other in the darkness and had chosen to heal together. That night, as the moon rose high above the forest canopy, Shadow curled up against the bear's warm body, finding comfort and security in the rhythm of his breathing and the steady beating of his heart. The bear wrapped his massive body protectively around the small pup, creating a fortress of warmth and safety. And in that shelter, beneath the stars and surrounded by the ancient forest, Shadow felt something he had thought was lost forever. He felt loved, he felt safe, and he felt like he belonged. The weeks that followed transformed Shadow's life in ways he could never have imagined possible, reshaping his entire understanding of what it meant to survive and to truly live. What had begun as a chance encounter beneath a broken bridge, a moment of fate that defied all logic and natural law, had blossomed into a genuine partnership and symbiotic relationship that allowed both creatures to not merely survive in the harsh wilderness, but to genuinely thrive and flourish in ways that enriched their very existence. The bear, whom Shadow had begun to think of simply as friend in his simple yet profound wolf mind, had taken on the role of protector and provider with a dedication and commitment that spoke volumes about the depth of his character and his extraordinary capacity for compassion and selfless love. Each morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the dense forest canopy in soft golden rays, Friend would venture into the forest with purposeful determination to hunt or fish, always returning with enough food for both of them to sustain themselves comfortably. Shadow watched with rapt attention and learned with the eagerness of youth, observing meticulously how the great bear moved through the forest with practiced efficiency and grace, how he read the subtle signs of prey and fresh water, how he navigated the complex and often treacherous terrain with the wisdom that came from decades of hard-earned survival experience. The bear seemed to take genuine pleasure in teaching the young wolf, in showing him the ancient ways of the forest through careful example and patient demonstration, as if he understood that passing on knowledge was a form of immortality. Shadow absorbed these invaluable lessons like a sponge absorbs water, his young and eager mind hungry to learn everything his unlikely mentor had to teach him. He learned which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to read the weather by observing the behavior of birds and insects, how to move silently through the underbrush without alerting prey, and how to use the terrain to his advantage when hunting. Friend taught him through action rather than words, understanding that the young wolf learned best by observation and imitation. There was a patience in the bear that seemed almost infinite, as if he had all the time in the world to ensure that Shadow understood each lesson completely before moving on to the next. One crisp autumn morning, when the leaves had begun their magnificent transformation into brilliant shades of crimson, gold, amber, and deep burgundy, creating a tapestry of color that seemed almost unreal in its beauty. Friend led Shadow to a place the pup had never ventured before. They traveled deeper into the forest than they ever had, moving through dense thickets that seemed to resist their passage, across rocky terrain that tested Shadow's growing strength and agility with every step, and through areas where the trees grew so close together that barely any light penetrated to the forest floor below. The bear moved with purposeful determination and unwavering confidence, his massive body navigating obstacles with surprising grace and fluidity despite his enormous size and weight. Shadow struggled to keep up, his shorter legs working overtime in a desperate effort to match the bear's steady pace, his muscles burning with exertion. But the young wolf refused to fall behind. Driven by an insatiable curiosity about where his companion was leading him and an absolute trust in Friend's judgment, he pushed himself harder than he ever had, his determination overcoming his physical limitations. After what felt like hours of travel through increasingly challenging terrain, they emerged from the dense forest into a hidden valley that took Shadow's breath away completely, leaving him momentarily paralyzed by the sheer beauty of what lay before him. It was a place of extraordinary and almost otherworldly beauty, a sheltered basin surrounded by towering cliffs that rose like ancient sentinels guarding some sacred and forbidden sanctuary. The cliffs themselves were magnificent, their faces carved by millions of years of erosion into intricate patterns and formations that seemed to tell the story of the Earth's ancient past. A crystal-clear lake occupied the center of the valley, its surface mirror-smooth and perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding mountains and sky with such perfect clarity that it was difficult to tell where the water ended and the sky began. The water was so transparent and pure that Shadow could see all the way to the bottom, where schools of fish darted and weaved in graceful, synchronized patterns, their silver scales catching and reflecting the sunlight. Waterfalls cascaded down the cliff faces from hidden sources high above, their white water creating a constant, soothing sound that seemed to echo through the entire valley like a natural symphony. The mist from the waterfalls created rainbows that danced and shifted in the sunlight, adding to the valley's dreamlike quality. The valley was surrounded by ancient pine and spruce trees, their towering forms providing shelter and shade. Wildflowers bloomed in scattered patches, their colors adding to the natural palette of the landscape. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine, water, and earth. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, a sanctuary preserved by the surrounding cliffs and hidden from the outside world. Friend approached the lake with the confidence of one who had been here many times before, and began to fish with a technique that Shadow found absolutely mesmerizing and worthy of careful study. The bear stood in the shallow water with incredible patience and focus, his massive body perfectly still and motionless, waiting with the discipline of a master hunter for the right moment to strike. His eyes tracked the movement of fish beneath the surface with laser-like intensity, and his body language communicated complete and utter concentration. When a large salmon leapt upstream in its desperate attempt to navigate the powerful waterfall and reach its spawning grounds, Friend struck with lightning-fast reflexes that seemed impossible for such a large creature. His massive paw flashed through the water with surprising precision and power, the movement so quick that Shadow could barely follow it with his eyes. Friend caught the fish effortlessly, the salmon thrashing and struggling in his grip, and then laid it carefully on the bank with surprising gentleness, as if he understood the value of his catch and wanted to treat it with respect. The bear returned to his patient vigil at the water's edge, his focus immediately returning to tracking the movements of the fish below the surface. Within the hour, he had caught several large salmon, more than enough for both of them to sustain themselves comfortably for the day. Each catch was handled with the same careful precision, laid out on the bank in an orderly fashion. Friend seemed to take pride in his work, and Shadow understood that hunting was not merely about survival for the bear. It was an art form, a skill honed over decades, a source of dignity and purpose. But it was not just the abundance of food that made this valley special and significant. As Shadow explored the area while Friend fished with his characteristic patience and focus, he discovered something that made his heart race with a complex mixture of emotions. Wolf tracks, fresh tracks, made within the last few days, still bearing the scent of their maker. His sensitive nose picked up the scent immediately, and he followed it with growing excitement and mounting trepidation, his entire body vibrating with conflicting emotions. These were not the tracks of his lost family. The scent was unfamiliar and strange to his nose, carrying the signature of a wolf he had never encountered before. But they were wolf tracks nonetheless. Unmistakable proof that other wolves existed in this forest. That he was not the last of his kind, that somewhere out there was a community of creatures like himself. The realization filled him with a complex mixture of hope, longing, and fear that seemed to war within his chest. Shadow followed the trail for a considerable distance, his instincts pulling him forward with an almost irresistible force, while his loyalty to Friend held him back like invisible chains. He found himself torn between two conflicting desires. The primal urge to find his own kind, to connect with others who shared his blood and his nature, and the paralyzing fear of losing the only companion and family he had left in this world. He stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively, his small body trembling with the weight of indecision, his mind racing with questions and doubts. The tracks led him deeper into the forest, away from the valley and away from Friend. Shadow's heart pounded in his chest as he wrestled with the decision before him. Should he follow? Should he seek out these other wolves and try to join their pack? Or should he return to Friend, to the safety and comfort of their established bond and routine? Friend appeared beside him as if summoned by Shadow's internal turmoil, having noticed the pup's absence and followed his scent through the forest. The bear studied the wolf tracks with what appeared to be complete understanding and empathy. And Shadow realized with sudden clarity that his companion knew exactly what the pup was feeling, understood the conflict and confusion that raged within his young heart. The bear had likely experienced similar moments of doubt and longing during his own long life. Friend made a low, rumbling sound, not threatening or aggressive, but contemplative and thoughtful, as if he were processing the significance of what they had found. Then Friend turned and began to walk back toward the lake with measured, deliberate steps, pausing only to glance back at Shadow with an expression that seemed to communicate volumes without words. "The choice is yours, little one," the bear's eyes seemed to say. "I will not hold you back if you wish to seek your own kind, but know that I will be here, waiting for you, if you choose to return." Shadow watched the bear retreat, his heart aching with the profound weight of the decision before him. He looked at the wolf tracks again, following them with his eyes, as far as he could see them disappearing into the forest. Then he looked back at Friend's retreating form, the massive bear growing smaller as he moved toward the lake. In that moment, standing between two possible futures, Shadow understood something profound and life-changing about loyalty and family. Family was not merely about blood or species or shared genetics. It was about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. About choosing to care for someone despite the difficulties and challenges that might arise. About finding home in another being rather than in a place or a people. It was about the bonds that transcended natural law and the ancient rules of the forest. It was about love in its purest and most selfless form. Shadow turned away from the wolf tracks, turning his back on what might have been his chance to find his own kind. It was not an easy decision, and it came with a bittersweet ache in his chest. But as he followed Friend back toward the lake, Shadow felt a sense of rightness and peace settle over him. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. When Shadow reached Friend at the lake's edge, the bear seemed to understand the significance of the pup's choice. Friend wrapped one massive paw gently around the young wolf, pulling him close with surprising tenderness, his enormous strength tempered by infinite gentleness. It was a gesture laden with multiple meanings: acceptance and approval, pride in Shadow's choice, and an affirmation of their bond. Shadow felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical temperature, a warmth that came from deep within, from the knowledge that he was loved and valued for who he was, not for what he could provide or what species he belonged to. That night, as they settled down to sleep beneath the vast expanse of stars in that hidden valley, Shadow reflected deeply on how much had changed in such a relatively short span of time. He had lost his family, his pack, his entire world in a single night of violence and chaos and destruction. His mother, his siblings, the familiar comfort of the den and the pack structure that had defined his existence. All of it had been torn away in an instant. The grief of that loss still lived within him, a scar that would never fully heal. But in losing everything, he had found something unexpected and infinitely precious: a true friend, a mentor, a family of a different kind. Friend had lost something too. Shadow could see it in the sadness that sometimes clouded the bear's eyes on quiet nights, in the way he would stare out at the forest with an expression of profound longing and regret. But together, they had found a way to heal, to build something new and meaningful from the ruins of their old lives, to transform their shared grief into shared joy and purpose. The valley became their sanctuary, their refuge from the harsh world outside, their home. Over the following weeks and months, as seasons shifted and changed, Shadow grew, stronger and more confident with each passing day. His fur became thick and lustrous, developing a beautiful sheen that spoke of good health and proper nutrition. His body filled out with proper nourishment and constant exercise, his muscles developing and strengthening until he was no longer a fragile pup, but a young wolf of considerable strength and capability. He learned to hunt alongside Friend, learning which prey was easiest to catch and which was best avoided, where to find the best fishing spots in the valley and beyond, how to read the weather and prepare for the changing seasons, how to move silently and strike with precision. Friend, in turn, seemed to gain something immeasurable from their companionship, a renewed sense of purpose and meaning, a reason to keep fighting against the encroaching old age and the weight of his own sorrows and regrets. The bear's movements became more energetic, his eyes brighter, his overall demeanor more vibrant and alive. One day, as they were hunting together in a dense forest far from their valley sanctuary, they encountered another predator, a large wolf, one of Shadow's own kind. The wolf was scarred and lean, clearly a lone hunter like Shadow had been not so long ago, a creature who had survived through solitude and self-reliance. The wolf's eyes widened with surprise and then deepened into suspicion as it took in the sight of a young wolf traveling alongside a grizzly bear, an alliance that violated every natural law and expectation of the forest. The wolf growled, a warning sound that carried within it a challenge and a threat. The sound of a creature asserting dominance and defending territory. The growl echoed through the forest, a primal sound that spoke of danger and confrontation. Friend stepped forward immediately, placing himself slightly in front of Shadow in a protective stance that communicated his willingness to defend his young companion against any threat. But Shadow, emboldened by months of growing confidence and the security of his companion's unwavering presence, stepped forward as well. He did not growl or bare his teeth in response to the other wolf's aggression. Instead, he stood tall and proud, his body language communicating strength and confidence rather than aggression or defensiveness. "I am not alone," Shadow seemed to say with his posture and presence, with the way he stood beside Friend without fear or hesitation. "I have found family where I least expected it, in a place where no one would have predicted such a bond could form. And I will not abandon it, not for the promise of my own kind, not for anything." The other wolf studied them for a long moment, clearly confused and uncertain about what he was witnessing, struggling to comprehend the nature of the relationship between these two creatures who should have been mortal enemies. The wolf's instincts warred within him, his predatory nature at odds with the evidence of his own eyes. Then, slowly and deliberately, the wolf lowered his head in a gesture of respect and submission, acknowledging the strength and unity he saw before him. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest as silently and mysteriously as he had appeared. Shadow understood that the wolf had recognized something in him, a strength born not from physical prowess alone, but from the bonds of loyalty and love that connected him to Friend, from the knowledge that he was part of something greater than himself. It was a strength that transcended species and natural law, a strength born from the heart rather than from muscle and fang. As the seasons changed and winter approached with its cold winds and shortened days, Shadow and Friend prepared their den for the long sleep ahead with the efficiency of creatures who had learned to work as a perfect team. They gathered food with careful planning, storing salmon that had been dried and preserved, collecting nuts and berries, ensuring they had sufficient provisions. They lined their shelter with soft grass and leaves, creating a comfortable nest where they could sleep through the long winter months. They made their preparations with the precision and care of creatures who understood the stakes of survival and who were determined to face the coming challenges together. Shadow was no longer the frightened, starving pup who had huddled beneath a broken bridge, trembling with fear and despair. He had become something more, a young wolf with wisdom beyond his years, a creature who understood that family came in many forms and took many unexpected shapes, and that love and loyalty were the greatest survival tools of all, more valuable than strength or speed or hunting prowess. On the night before they entered their winter den, Shadow and Friend stood together on a high ridge overlooking the vast expanse of forest below them. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light across the landscape in ethereal patterns that seemed almost magical. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, billions of points of light stretching across the darkness of space. Friend looked down at his small companion, with eyes that held the weight of years and the depth of genuine affection and love. Shadow looked up at his friend, his heart full of gratitude and love that seemed almost too large to contain within his small body. In that moment, beneath the stars and surrounded by the vast wilderness that had tested and shaped them both, two broken souls had found wholeness and healing. They had found home in each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that the greatest strength lies not in power or dominance, but in the bonds we forge with others and the love we choose to share. The first snow fell on a gray November morning, transforming the forest into a landscape of pristine white and crystalline beauty that seemed almost unreal in its perfection. Shadow watched from the entrance of their den as the delicate flakes descended from the heavy, pregnant clouds above, each one a tiny miracle of ice and geometric precision, a masterpiece of nature's artistry. The snow accumulated quickly and relentlessly, covering the ground in a thick blanket that muffled all sound and seemed to isolate their valley from the rest of the world, creating a sanctuary of silence and solitude. Friend stood beside him, his massive form dark and imposing against the white background, his breath forming clouds of mist in the frigid air that seemed to carry the weight of the coming months. Winter has come. Friend's expression seemed to communicate, though no words passed between them, for they had developed a language beyond speech, a form of understanding that transcended the limitations of vocal communication. They had prepared as well as they could during the autumn months, gathering food with meticulous care and supplies with the wisdom of experience. But Shadow knew with absolute certainty that the months ahead would test them in ways they had not yet experienced together, would push them to their limits and beyond. The den they had chosen was perfect for their needs, a natural cave in the mountainside that seemed almost deliberately designed by nature for their purposes. It was sheltered by overhanging rocks and surrounded by dense evergreen trees that provided additional protection from the harsh winds that would soon sweep across the landscape with devastating force. Friend had lived through many winters in his long and eventful life, enduring countless seasons of hardship and survival. And he had chosen this location with the wisdom and experience that only decades of living could provide. The cave was deep enough to provide adequate warmth during the coldest nights, with a small opening that allowed smoke from their occasional fires to escape while keeping the worst of the cold and wind at bay. The floor was relatively smooth and dry, and Friend had helped Shadow gather moss and soft materials to create a comfortable bedding area where they could rest during the long, dark nights. As the weeks progressed and winter deepened its iron grip on the forest, as the landscape transformed into a realm of ice and snow and frozen beauty, Shadow discovered that surviving the cold required a different kind of strength than hunting or running or the physical challenges he had faced before. It required patience, the kind of patience that came from understanding that survival was a long-term endeavor, not a series of immediate challenges. It required endurance, the ability to maintain hope and determination even when faced with seemingly endless hardship. It required the ability to remain calm and centered during long periods of confinement, to find peace in stillness and solitude, to accept that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in action, but in acceptance. The days grew shorter with each passing week, with the sun barely clearing the horizon before beginning its rapid descent once more, as if it too were struggling against the weight of winter's dominance. The temperature dropped until it seemed that the very air itself had frozen solid, until breathing became a physical challenge that required conscious effort. The moisture in the air froze on the rocks and trees, creating intricate patterns of ice that sparkled in the weak sunlight. The forest became a world of white and gray and silver, beautiful but harsh, serene but unforgiving. Friend taught Shadow how to conserve energy during the winter months, how to rest and sleep for extended periods without becoming restless or anxious, how to accept the limitations that winter imposed upon them. The bear explained through his actions and example, through the patient demonstration of his own behavior, that winter was not a time for activity and constant motion, but for reflection and rest, for turning inward and finding peace in stillness. They would spend long hours in the den, Shadow curled against Friend's warm body, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling grateful for the shelter and warmth they shared, for the companionship that made the long nights bearable. Shadow learned to recognize the different sounds of winter, the creak of branches laden with snow, the crack of ice forming on the lake. the distant howl of wolves struggling to survive in the harsh conditions. He learned to find comfort in the rhythm of Friend's breathing, in the steady beat of the bear's heart, in the knowledge that he was not alone in facing these challenges. One particularly cold night, when the temperature had dropped so far that ice formed on the inside of the cave entrance, creating a crystalline barrier between them and the outside world, Shadow woke to find Friend trembling uncontrollably. The bear's breathing was labored and irregular, coming in shallow gasps that spoke of physical distress. His massive body was racked with violent shivers that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Shadow immediately moved closer, pressing his small form against Friend's side, trying desperately to share what little warmth his young body possessed, knowing instinctively that his companion needed him. He whined softly, a sound of concern and worry that came from deep within his heart, from a place of pure emotion that transcended rational thought. The whine was a plea, a prayer, a desperate attempt to communicate his fear and his love and his determination to help, no matter what it took. Friend seemed to sense Shadow's distress, made a low rumbling sound that was meant to be comforting, though it came out weak and strained. The bear's massive paw reached out with trembling movements and gently pulled the young wolf closer. And Shadow realized with a sinking feeling in his chest that Friend was not just trembling from the cold. He was sick, genuinely ill with something that his powerful body could not easily overcome. The realization filled Shadow with a fear more intense and more overwhelming than any he had experienced since that terrible night when he had lost his family, when his entire world had been torn apart by violence and chaos. For 3 days, Friend lay in the den, his massive body weakened by fever and illness that seemed to ravage him from within. His breathing became increasingly labored, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. Shadow stayed constantly at his side, never leaving, refusing to eat even when hunger gnawed at his belly with insistent demands. He licked the bear's face and ears with gentle persistence, trying to cool the fever that burned within his companion, trying to communicate his love and support through physical touch. He whined and paced, his young mind desperate to find some way to help his companion, to save the being who had saved him, to prevent the loss of the one creature who meant everything to him. Shadow brought Snow into the den and placed it against Friend's body, trying to lower the fever through any means available to him. He lay pressed against the bear during the night, sharing his body heat, staying awake to monitor his companion's breathing and vital signs. He prayed to forces he did not fully understand, begging the universe to spare his friend, to allow them to continue their journey together. On the second day, Friend's condition worsened. The bear's eyes closed, and he seemed to slip into a state of semi-consciousness from which Shadow could not rouse him. The young wolf's desperation reached a peak, and he ventured out into the snow, hunting frantically for any food that might provide nourishment and strength to his weakened companion. He caught a rabbit and brought it back to the den, but Friend could not eat, his body too consumed by fever and illness to accept food. On the third night, when Shadow had begun to lose hope entirely, when he had started to accept with a heavy heart that Friend might not recover, when he had begun to prepare himself emotionally for a loss that seemed inevitable, the fever broke. Friend's breathing became easier and more regular, the labored gasping replaced by deeper, more natural breaths. His eyes cleared as consciousness and awareness returned fully to his massive body. The bear looked at Shadow with an expression of profound gratitude and something else, a recognition of the depth of the young wolf's love and loyalty, an acknowledgement of the sacrifices Shadow had made during those terrible 3 days. Friend's recovery was slow and gradual, his strength returning incrementally over the following weeks. The bear remained weak for a long time, his massive body depleted by the illness and requiring extensive rest and nourishment to rebuild. Shadow hunted small game in the snow, with a determination and focus born of necessity, bringing rabbits and other creatures back to the den with meticulous regularity, to ensure that Friend had adequate nutrition to rebuild his strength. The young wolf had grown into a capable and skilled hunter, and he used every skill Friend had taught him during their months together to keep his companion fed and healthy. Shadow would venture out into the snow each day, tracking prey through the white landscape, using the techniques Friend had taught him to move silently and strike with precision. He would return to the den with his catch, and Friend would eat slowly, his appetite gradually returning as his strength increased. It was exhausting work, and Shadow often returned to the den exhausted and cold. But he never complained, never hesitated, never considered abandoning his responsibility to his companion. As Friend recovered, Shadow realized something important and transformative about their relationship, something that fundamentally altered his understanding of their bond. He was no longer just the student being taught by the master, the young creature learning from an older, wiser mentor. He had become a caregiver, a protector, someone upon whom Friend depended for survival, someone whose actions and choices directly determined whether his companion lived or died. The roles had shifted, and Shadow had risen to meet the challenge with a maturity and selflessness that surprised even himself. Their bond had deepened and transformed into something even more profound than it had been before, something that transcended the simple relationship of teacher and student. They were truly partners now, equals in their commitment to each other, each caring for the other with complete and unconditional love, each willing to sacrifice everything for the other's well-being. Shadow understood now that love was not about one creature being stronger or more capable than the other. It was about mutual commitment, about showing up for each other in times of need, about proving through actions and sacrifice that the other being's well-being was as important as one's own survival. Winter continued its relentless assault on the forest, its icy grip tightening with each passing week. Snow piled higher and higher, creating drifts that made travel nearly impossible, that transformed the landscape into a maze of white obstacles and hidden dangers. The temperature remained brutally cold, dropping to levels that seemed almost incomprehensible, that made even breathing painful as the frigid air seared the lungs. Food became scarcer as prey animals either hibernated in dens and burrows or migrated to warmer climates in search of sustenance. The forest seemed to shut down, to enter a state of hibernation and dormancy, leaving little for predators to hunt. But Shadow and Friend had prepared well during the autumn months, gathering food with foresight and care, storing preserved salmon and other provisions in a hidden cache near their den. Their stores of preserved food sustained them through the worst months, though Shadow supplemented their diet by hunting whenever possible, by using his smaller size and greater agility to access prey that the larger bear could not reach. They rationed carefully, eating only what they needed, making their supplies last as long as possible. One night, as they lay together in the warmth of their den, wrapped in furs and surrounded by the comfort of each other's presence, Friend began to tell his story. Though he could not speak in words, though vocal communication was impossible for a bear, Friend communicated through images and sensations and emotions that Shadow somehow understood. A form of communication that had developed between them over their months together. A language of the heart that transcended the limitations of species and biology. Shadow learned that Friend had once had a family too, a mate and cubs that he had loved with all his heart, with an intensity and depth of feeling that rivaled the love he now felt for Shadow. Friend had been a strong and capable provider, a devoted father who taught his cubs the ways of the forest, who protected them with fierce devotion. But humans had come to the forest with guns and traps, hunting bears for sport and profit, driven by greed and bloodlust and a fundamental disrespect for the natural world. Friend had lost his family to those hunters, watching helplessly as his loved ones were killed, unable to prevent the tragedy, powerless to save those he loved most. The images Friend shared were painful to witness. The sound of gunshots, the smell of blood, the desperate attempts to protect his family as they were hunted down. Shadow felt his companion's anguish as if it were his own, understood the depth of the trauma and loss that Friend had endured. Friend had survived, but the loss had nearly destroyed him, had nearly broken his spirit beyond repair. For years, he had wandered alone through the forest, angry and bitter, believing that life held nothing but pain and suffering, that love and connection only led to devastating loss and unbearable grief. He had isolated himself, pushing away other bears, avoiding any possibility of forming new bonds or relationships. He had become a ghost, a shadow of his former self, merely existing rather than truly living. Then Shadow had come into his life, appearing beneath that bridge like a gift from fate. And everything had changed in ways that Friend could never have anticipated. The young wolf had given Friend a reason to live again, had reminded him that love and connection were possible even after devastating loss, that the heart had the capacity to heal and to open itself to new relationships and new possibilities. In saving Shadow's life, Friend had actually saved his own. He had found purpose and meaning again, had discovered that life still held beauty and joy and the possibility of redemption. Shadow listened to this story with his heart aching for his companion's past suffering, but also with profound gratitude for the way that suffering had somehow led Friend to be in that place at that moment when Shadow needed him most. It was as if their meeting had been written in the stars, as if fate or providence or some greater force had brought them together because they both needed what the other could provide, because they were meant to heal each other's wounds through love and loyalty and mutual care. As winter slowly began to release its grip on the forest, as the days grew longer and the temperature began to rise with agonizing slowness, as the first signs of spring began to appear in subtle ways, Shadow reflected on everything he had learned during these long months of confinement and closeness. He had learned that strength was not just about physical prowess or hunting ability or the capacity to overcome physical obstacles. It was about loyalty, about the willingness to care for another being even when it was difficult, about finding joy and meaning in connection with others, about the courage to love despite the risk of loss. He had learned that family was not just about blood relationships or shared species. It was about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, about choosing to care for another being even when that care required sacrifice and effort. It was about finding home in another being rather than in a place or a people, about understanding that the greatest strength lies in vulnerability and in the willingness to depend on others. One morning in late February, when the first signs of spring were beginning to appear with increasing clarity, the sound of birds returning from their winter migration, their songs filling the forest with life and hope, the slight softening of the snow as the sun's warmth began to penetrate the frozen landscape, the subtle shift in the quality of light as the days grew longer. Friend and Shadow emerged from their den. They had survived the winter together, had emerged stronger and more bonded than ever before, had proven through their actions that their bond could withstand any challenge, could survive any hardship. They stood at the entrance of their den for a long moment, breathing in the air of early spring, feeling the subtle warmth of the sun on their fur. Friend stretched his massive body, his muscles working out the stiffness that came from months of relative inactivity. Shadow did the same, his young body eager for movement and activity after the long confinement. As they stood at the entrance of their den, looking out at the forest beginning to awaken from its long winter sleep, Shadow realized that he had been fundamentally transformed by his experience. He was no longer the frightened pup who had lost everything, who had huddled beneath a bridge trembling with fear and despair. He was a young wolf with a family, with a home, with a purpose and a future. He was a creature who understood the meaning of love and loyalty, who had learned that the greatest strength comes not from power, but from connection. And he knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever difficulties and hardships the future might bring, he would face them with Friend at his side, secure in the knowledge that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. Friend looked down at Shadow with eyes full of love and pride and gratitude. The bear had also been transformed by their time together, had undergone a fundamental healing of his wounded heart. He had discovered that life still held beauty and meaning and joy, that the capacity to love and to be loved did not disappear with loss and grief, but rather was deepened and enriched by those experiences. He had found redemption and purpose through his relationship with Shadow, had learned that the greatest legacy one could leave was the love and care given to another being. Together, they walked away from the den toward the valley that had become their home, toward the lake where they had first truly bonded, toward the future that awaited them. They moved with the confidence of creatures who had faced hardship together and emerged stronger for it, who had tested their bond in the crucible of winter and found it unbreakable. They moved as a family, united by bonds that transcended species and natural law, bound together by love and loyalty that had been forged in the crucible of shared experience and mutual care, that had been tested and proven true through months of hardship and challenge. The long winter had ended, but the bond between them would endure forever, a testament to the power of connection and the transformative nature of love, a living proof that family could be found in the most unexpected places and that love could bloom between the most unlikely companions.